Good afternoon. We're going to call the meeting to order. Public comment will be called at the end of each agenda item, and I will ask that you line up behind the podium to provide your comments. Happy to see fellow board members Jamie Weisinger and Brandon Tucker in attendance. At this time, I'll ask for a motion and second to approve the October 10th minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor? Can we vote? Do we have a quorum?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yvette, do we have any agenda revisions?
No agenda revisions.
Okay, we'll move on to the Lake Okeechobee burn update, and I'll call Rory Feeney, our Land Resources Bureau Chief. If he's here, there he is.
What's that? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Rory Feeney. I would like to provide the committee with an update on the burn activity on Lake Okeechobee. As I mentioned in past presentations, the fire in Florida naturally plays an important role in improving and maintaining a healthy ecosystem. The areas targeted for prescribed burns on Lake Okeechobee are dominated by a thick mass of cattails, wax myrtles, and other low-quality vegetation. By removing this biomass, it allows more desirable vegetation to return, which actually improves nutrient uptake and enhances the area for fisheries and resident wildlife. I'd also like to take a moment to recap this past year's success with prescribed fire. This slide depicts a 5-year average of acres burned by district staff on district lands by numbers of fires and average acres of fire, per fire for each fiscal year from 2013 to 2018. You can see in 2017 through 18, we had a very successful year. We burned 26,000 acres, over 53 fires, at an average size of 491 acres per fire. That represents about 6,000 acres above our 5-year average. And so far, we have burned an additional 3,000 acres across 9 fires. Now, this graph depicts the prescribed burn activity conducted by the interagency team on Lake Okeechobee since 2013. The interagency team is made up of the South Florida Water Management District, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Audubon Society, the Corps of Engineers, and what am I leaving out? Forestry. The slide depicts also a 5-year data, and right off the bat you can see that there have been only 7 burns in the past 5 years, totaling roughly about 14,000 acres. But burning on the lake has its own unique challenges compared to upland burns throughout Florida. Burning a lake is like dealing with Goldilocks. Our burn managers need to look at drought and fire indices, lake levels, topography, available fuel sources, nesting seasons, and wind speed and direction. These slides depict the drought index, which is measured by the moisture in the first 8 inches of soil. In June of this year, the drought index was far to the left, with conditions being too wet to burn. Just 6 months later, you can see on that picture on the right, we find ourselves in the mid to upper levels of the drought index, with conditions right to burn. While the drought index continued to increase across Florida, as depicted in the previous slide I showed you, the fire danger indices across the state remain relatively low. On that picture on the left, you can see that most of Florida is green, which means the fire danger is low. And that relates to any potential county burn bans that forestry may impose upon each county. So as of November 27th, there are currently no burn bans in Florida except for one in the Panhandle. Those other blocks are just county ordinances on burns, not related to an official burn ban. The amount of burnable habitat in Lake Okeechobee's marsh is strongly influenced by lake stage. Because of its shallow slope, large areas of marsh can become exposed with relatively small decreases in lake stage. For example, 22,000 acres, more or less, of the western marsh are exposed at a lake stage of 14 feet. Nearly 60,000 acres are exposed at a lake stage of 13 feet, and more than 100,000 acres are exposed at a stage of 10 feet. Currently, lake levels are at 12.82 feet, which means that approximately 59,000 acres of littoral zone is exposed. This, however, does not directly relate to the amount of combustible fuels. As we saw last week, about 25% of the burn unit was dry enough to actually burn. Here's a closer look at the bathymetry in the Moorhaven and Indian Prairie marshes. Our burn bosses will analyze the available fuel sources in advance of the burn to get the most ecological benefit from their work. Implementing an effective burn will reduce the occurrences of excessive large marsh fires that are difficult to control. Our managed approach to prescribed burning will limit or eliminate burning during periods when the most of the marsh is exposed and fuel loads are at their highest. Targeted areas are burned when lake stages are receding or increasing, and portions of the marsh are inundated. Higher elevation sites that burn are depleted of fuel, so they may serve as fire breaks for secondary burns when the water levels decline further. And then also, we need to incorporate protecting species of concern. Before the prescribed burn, we need to identify any at-risk species, such as the Everglades snailkite. Staff will coordinate with state and federal agencies to work outside of nesting season if possible and create buffers around known snailkite nests during nesting season. But resident wildlife respond very well to natural and prescribed fires. You'll often see birds flying near the flames, near the head of the flames, eating up all the insects that are fleeing from the area. Animals have adapted to fleeing from fire and will return to a more productive and diverse habitat. And then winds. We need to wait on the winds till they're just right. The right winds are critical for any prescribed burn, particularly around the perimeter of Lake Okeechobee. A prescribed fire with the wrong winds can cause smoke impacts to residences and businesses and cause major highway shutdowns for hours, even days. So, on December 3rd, the lake levels and winds aligned, which gave our team the green light to submit the prescription to the Division of Forestry. And all this data tells us that the conditions need to be just right. Not too wet, not too dry, when the wind's in the right direction, at the right speed. When all those things align, we can hit the nail on the head and proceed. And that's what we did this past year. Working with FWC, Forestry, and others, we were able to pull off some very successful burns. On March 2nd, we added our Indian Prairie prescribed burn, 780 acres. Sportsman's Cut, about 3,820 acres. And the West Wall burn that FWC led, which was 450 acres. Since then, though, we've been working throughout the summer and received reimbursements from Florida Forest Service for the work conducted last fiscal year. We applied for and were awarded a Forest Service grant to fund Lake Okeechobee burns during this fiscal year. We drafted stage-related burns for Lake Okeechobee and attended the Lake Okeechobee Interagency Team meeting led by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission on November 6, 2018. So as you can see, the planning effort for these burns began several weeks in advance. So by the time the day rolls around to burn, we've already obtained authorization from forestry, mobilized staff and equipment, identified resources at risk, such as any structures or water quality monitoring stations. We've coordinated with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on listed species, disc levees for fire breaks, and coordinated aerial ignition plans with our flight operations. So in this photo, you can see our partners from forestry, FWC, and the Corps meeting in the morning to go over the prescription, safety protocols, and communication. And so that photo was from last week, right before we did our most recent burn. So on December 3rd, we had our Moorhaven burn. We targeted 10,000 acres, but as I mentioned before, the conditions were still drying out. We burned about 25% or so of that burn. That gives us a good foothold to go back and burn off of that area. We'll continue to work those areas as the wind and water levels recede. But it was a successful burn. We removed biomass and promoted desirable native vegetation return and enhanced the area for wildlife and wading birds. Our next steps for Moorhaven and Indian Prairie Marshes, we'll be conducting field evaluations to see how moisture levels are affecting the plant communities. As mentioned before, waiting for the lower water levels to expose more fine fuels. We'll be coordinating with the Fish and Wildlife Commission with an eye on waterfowl hunting and monitoring snail, kite, and wading bird nesting. So we anticipate burning that Moorhaven and Indian Prairie Marsh area come January, but you should know that today we have our team back out there again, working an area called the Sports Haven Ridge. We're targeting about 3,000 acres as depicted in that arrow in that picture there. We believe it's dry enough to pull off a good burn, so as soon as I hear back from my folks, I'll give everybody an update on that. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Roy. Anybody have any questions?
No. Thank you. Rory, give me a sense of how the ecology responds to some of these burns, as far as fish habitats, nesting. Obviously, you're working with Fish and Wildlife to determine, what the impacts are. What do you guys see after this? Do the birds and fish move out, and then once the burns are done, they move back in? Is there exposed areas to propagate species? Just give me a sense of what the ecology, how that works.
Yeah, it responds very well. I mean, it's amazing. If you go back a few days after a burn, you'll see how the wildlife just really taken advantage of the new growth, the tender vegetation that comes back. Last week, we burned a lot of wax myrtle, which is kind of undesirable for the wildlife out there. The burns can expose more sandy bottoms, which benefit the fishery habitats, increase spawning, more fish, more wading birds, more diversity. It will help with sustained benefits like that. You'll start seeing benefits to the recreational fishing in these areas. So it's a good thing all around.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is it's sustained. It's not just immediate after the burn. The burns that were done at Moonshine Bay 3 years ago, I think, are still the go-to location for foraging for the wading birds. And most importantly, on the lake is for snail kites. We hadn't seen very much snail kite nesting activity in 10 years. And 2 years ago, I think we had almost 200 nests there, and they're all located in that area that was burned, where the torpedo grass, which really just overtakes everything. And they typically are doing a combination of spraying the torpedo grass first, following that up by a burn to really open those areas up. And so it's not just within a short time period after the burn, it's sustained over a couple years in areas that have been burned.
Super. That answered a couple of my questions. I was wondering, how long this does last for. I think I'm interested too in, you mentioned that some parts are being sprayed and then burned. With the areas that are just being sprayed, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next section, but, the biomass, when you spray plants and then they die and the biomass sinks, and then methane is released into the water, and it's a real problem. So I guess I'm wondering, you don't have that problem when you burn. We don't see that kind of issue with the water. Like if it sprays and it dies and it sinks and it muddies up the water, you don't see that with the burn. Burn has like an immediate benefit.
Correct. The burn that was conducted 3 years ago probably would not have been as successful had we not sprayed ahead of time, though. So it's part of our integrated pest management approach, where we use them in concert. So there was about 7,000 acres that was burned during that period because there was some spraying ahead of time. If we were to just do burning, you wouldn't be able to get the effect of burns in all these areas that we've targeted in the past 5 years.
So what parts of the lake, because we know they're spraying a lot, and we know that we've been limited in how much we could burn of what's been sprayed. So how many acres do we have the opportunity now in these specific conditions to go back and take advantage of the spray and the burn while we have these conditions? Because it is such an issue, trying to keep back some of this invasive these invasive exotics. If we can really get in there, do we have any barriers to you guys just being able to, like you said today, there was some conditions that were favorable, you're out there, you're just gonna be proactive. Is there anything inhibiting that for you guys as, you know, you see openings? Are we okay to keep going when the
We're
conditions are
continuing to
favorable?
look, yeah, anytime we see opportunities to burn even just 400 or 500 acres, 1,000 acres at a time, we're going to be doing that. And that will become more apparent as lake levels recede. Right now, we're still around 13 feet. We need to let the vegetation senesce and dry out, age a bit before we have an effective burn. What you wouldn't want to do is mobilize and get out there, and just because it's exposed, light a match, and then nothing really happens. You want to have an effective burn and use your tools the right way.
Super.
So
Are
there
we-
will be opportunity, to answer your question, yes, there will be opportunities to burn. And forestry has been working with us hand in hand. FWC, the Corps has been helping us along the levees. So I don't see any logistical issues on that end. It really comes down to Mother Nature.
Great. And are we burning any muck?
No.
Are we able
We're
to
trying
burn
to,
any
we're trying to
muck?
avoid that.
Okay.
The other thing too, Melanie, is that here this last year, so that we have a proactive, only, from not forestry, but FWC from the district, we did apply for TIF to allow us to burn too. So now there's 3 agencies that can be totally focused on burning. So if one agency gets tied up, we can step in, or FWC or forestry. So through that grant funding and through the permission through TIF, it grants us the right to take the lead also. So now 3 agencies are focused on it.
Super. Well, I can't wait to get out there and check it out. Thanks. Oh, one more.
One more, thank you. Theoretically, when you remove mass from the lake, we should be able to put more water in the lake. Is there a way to measure the effects of that?
The volume that the vegetation is occupying in the water column, that'd be a good question for our,
But there is a correlation between the two, correct?
I don't know that that's measurable. And the only thing I would just add to the previous discussion, when you think about some of the burn areas, a lot of where we focus is in the littoral zone area of the lake, where those marshes, like as where stages are dropping, they're going to go dry completely. When we talk, some, I know you're going to have a discussion on spraying, some of those are the navigation channels where you've got deep water, and as that material dies and sinks to the bottom, that's a lot of what I know the concerns are. But in the marsh, you're typically, those stages are going dry every year as well.
Thanks, Rory.
okay, thank you.
Okay, next we've got Lake Okeechobee Invasive Plant Management and Mariah McInnes, FWC Regional Biologist. Oh, do we have public comment on the section 4? Martha.
Martha Musgrove, Florida Wildlife Federation. Do you post signs before you burn, or do you rely on the Fish and Wildlife Commission to notify the hunters in the area?
There are public notices that go out on our website to all stakeholders, and I believe we may also do posting at boat ramps, but we have a pretty aggressive outreach component here at the district, and our burn managers will also go speak with any impacted stakeholders as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's usually on the FWC website, isn't it?
Mhm.
If you click on that area, they usually have some kind of a blurb about where they're burning, so. Yeah, I think most of the.
Yeah,
the
it's a short
organizations-
window.
Yeah.
We don't know sometimes until the morning of, but it'll be on our website, FWC's, and also forestry as well. It keeps a pretty neat interactive map that you should check out. It shows all the prescribed fires, wildfires, historical fires.
And then we get a lot of hunters who, while they have their licenses, they're not residents of the area. So I was going to ask if you posted something.
Anybody that's hunting here is going to have a Florida license, and then they're going to check, well,
They do it illegally if they don't have.
good luck to them. I wouldn't want to mess with an FWC officer. Okay, Ms. McInnes, welcome.
Hello. So my name is Mariah McInnes. I am the regional biologist in the press it. Oh, I have to hold it while I talk. Okay. All right. My name is Mariah McInnes. I am the regional biologist for the invasive plant management section within the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I work in the South region, so one of my main water bodies is Lake Okeechobee. This presentation is a frequently asked questions and concerns compiled pretty much from the most common questions and concerns I get about our program on Lake Okeechobee. So just first off, why are we targeting these plants? What makes them so bad? So when I refer to floating plants, I'm referring to both water lettuce and water hyacinth. Both of them are free floating. They're not rooted to the bottom. They are non-native to Florida, so they don't have any of the normal things that keep them in check in their native ranges. This allows them to explode in huge amounts. They pose a significant threat to our native plants, our wildlife, navigation, and flood control. As you can see from this photo, this is just nothing but water hyacinth. And they create these huge mats that block out sunlight, they reduce oxygen, they have a really negative impact on the ecosystem as a whole. Water hyacinth in particular can grow really large and quite heavy, and it can even uproot native plants as it's blown around. It can uproot submerged vegetation and emergent vegetation as well. They're also prime mosquito habitat. They have these like perfect little cupped-like leaves when they're young. That's a big breeding ground for mosquitoes. And because we live in sunny Florida, and even through the winter when it gets colder, they still grow quickly all year round. So this is just another perspective of how crazy these plants can get. I took this picture myself on the west side of Ritta Island just a few months ago. This should all be open water that you're looking at, and this is nothing but water lettuce, just super dense. Nothing is going to thrive underneath that. None of your sunlight is getting underneath there. They can be really detrimental. And then this is another photo from 1986 when there was a moratorium on the spray program. They stopped spraying altogether, and then they relied solely on harvesters. And in the photo, you can see a harvester there trying to keep up with the amount of plants in the canal there. This is the Moorhaven Canal. Again, that should all be open water. So as you can see, that the harvester is really barely keeping up with the amount of plants. So how is the spraying organized, and where can I find the schedule? I create the schedule on a weekly basis, and this is based off of my own personal airboat surveys as well as our monthly helicopter flights that we have. It's an interagency flight where myself and then members of other agencies, including the district, the Corps of Engineers, and then we also have some contract managers as well on the flight. We go around together and we kind of estimate the number of plants as we go along, and this gives me a really good idea as far as where these hotspot areas are on the lake. Because they're floating, the plants are constantly moving, so it's something, that's why we do it monthly, so we constantly have to check up on that. And like I said, I create the schedules weekly, and they can be found online. All of the information you could possibly want is there, including the species that are targeted, the herbicide that I'm using, the rate of herbicide, and the specific areas that the contractors are instructed to go to. So the applicators are spraying, killing everything. This is something I hear a lot about. And our applicators use a variety of herbicides. There's a misconception that they're just broadcasting a very general herbicide that kills everything, but we actually use a few different highly selective herbicides. I actually use the highly selective herbicides more than I use anything else, and the herbicides are determined on what situation the plants are in, what native vegetation are present. So as you can see in this picture, the dead stuff you're looking at, all the brown, is water hyacinth, and in the background there you can see the desirable natives, which are your spike rush and your lily pads. So someone who's driving by in a boat might see brown and just automatically assume, oh, well, they're killing everything, and they don't understand that that's something that shouldn't even be there in the first place. The work is assessed post-treatment, so that's also part of what I'm doing when I'm out on the airboats, is I'm looking at, I'm wanting to see something like in this picture, and I'm able to see if there's any non-target damage, which is the best way to assess if the contractors are, targeting the right species or not. And if that situation arises, I'm able to take a point and use the contractor's tracks and figure out exactly what happened. So the contractors are not managed and do whatever they want. So we currently have 3 different contractors on the lake. We have Applied Aquatic, who is our main contractor. We have AVC, Aquatic Vegetation Control, which is our secondary contractor. And then we have Lake and Wetland, which is our third contractor that's brought in usually when things get too crazy for the other contractors to handle. We bring in a third one. They're divided into 3 regions, so they never cross into each other's regions. This is a way that we're able to kind of keep their work separated. And like I mentioned, the work is assigned weekly, and it's always publicly available. They are required to check in with me daily. I actually hear from them twice a day. I hear from them in the morning. They'll check in with me, tell me where they're at, how many boats they have, because that can kind of, vary depending on their availability. And then they'll call me at the end of the day and tell me, how the day went, how many acres they treated, and give me any additional notes or things. They also send me their GPS tracks weekly. Like I mentioned, I can use this when I assess their work post-treatment. If I take a point or someone sends me a point or there's just a certain area that I want to check on, I can literally see exactly where they've been, which is really helpful. They also all have to be licensed by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. I've taken this test. It's challenging. It's not just something you can walk in and pass without any studying. They also have to have an aquatic certification on top of that, which requires passing the 2 tests. And then to keep up with this, they have to attend annual trainings. So they're constantly going to workshops and trainings and getting these continued education units, which is what is required to keep up with their licensing. And most importantly, our applicators get paid hourly. They don't get paid by the amount of herbicide they use. I do not mind if they go out there and they don't find any plants. I like that. That's good news for me. I'd rather them go out and just do a survey and let me know what they're seeing. There's no incentive for them to be spraying herbicide if there's not plants. They get reimbursed for the chemical they used, no more, no less. So like I said, they're not gaining anything by spraying more than they need to. And whether they spray 10 acres or 1 acre, they are not rewarded or reprimanded either way. So with all that being said, I believe that our contractors are trained and skilled and they have every tool in their toolbox to do the job correctly and efficiently, but they're humans. I'm aware of that. So that's why I encourage anyone that has any questions or anything to just reach out to me. If you see anything that looks weird, I always encourage our stakeholders to take a picture, a video. That is my work cell. You can send me videos and pictures directly, and I'm always wanting to go out and look at these things. My job is to, manage them and stay on top of them, so I welcome, any information at all. So why don't we utilize harvesting? There's a few reasons why we don't utilize harvesting. Unfortunately, they're non-selective. A lot of people picture them being kind of like a fine-tooth comb and picking up exactly what we want, but it's more of a ripping mechanism. It takes everything in its path, including the native vegetation that we like, the native wildlife that we like. So, that's when we go out there and we spray and we're using these selective herbicides, we're doing it to preserve the native habitat. So harvesters pretty much do the opposite. They're just taking everything with them. They're very slow. They can only do 2 to 8 acres a day. And on Okeechobee, I would anticipate it would take even, longer to get acres done, just because the issue with harvesting is they have to collect all of this vegetation, but then they have to go and dump it. And with the size of Okeechobee, you can imagine how long it would take them to just go back and forth between, a dump site. Because of this, they're really slow, but then they're also really expensive. So they can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 per acre. And compared to using an airboat spraying herbicide, that only costs $150 per acre. So as far as a cost perspective, it's way more efficient to use herbicide. Again, like I said, they only cover small areas because they have to constantly return to shore, and that creates the issue of having a dump site in general. So that contributes to the cost. You have to have an area set aside to be able to dump all this vegetation, and that's always an issue. So spraying just causes the plants to accumulate on the lake bottom. There's no denying that when you spray vegetation, it's gonna fall out, it's gonna die, it's gonna go to the bottom. But unfortunately, these plants continue to shed just like a tree in your front yard would. As you can see from this picture, this is what water hyacinth looks like. You know, you only see the green stuff on the top, but underneath there's a lot of decayed material that's constantly falling out and dropping down. And they continue to do this throughout their entire life. So there was actually a study done that showed that 1 acre of water hyacinth can deposit as much as 500 tons of plant material on the bottom of a waterway yearly. From our perspective, we want to do what's called maintenance control, which means that we would rather treat a plant when it's the size of a baseball and have just that amount fall to the bottom versus letting the plants just grow out of control and sending more and more to the bottom. And also, you know, while those plants continue to grow, they're also going to shed. So that's why we want to spray these plants where they're in the smallest possible amounts, because we want to reduce as much plants going to the bottom as possible. So stop spraying the hydrilla. We actually don't treat hydrilla on Lake Okeechobee unless it's causing navigational issues, which is very rare. And to show how rare that is, I just included the last 2 times that we treated it. So most recently was in Pierce Canal in 2016, and that was in a canal and at the request of boaters because they literally couldn't get through. Because of Lake Okeechobee's water levels, hydrilla pretty much does its own thing. It stays in a nice little happy medium depending on the water levels. So, you know, if we get really high water really quickly, you will see a decrease in hydrilla. Of course, after Irma, we saw a decrease in hydrilla, and you know, we get blamed a lot for that, but actually, I don't touch it. I don't have any reason to. So there's been a significant loss of submerged vegetation. So we agree that there's definitely been a loss of submerged vegetation. This is caused by high water events that deprive the plants of sunlight. So as the water goes up really high, the plants don't have time to keep growing with the water column, and because of that, they aren't able to get enough sunlight to keep growing. Also, when the water gets high like that, it creates more wave action and it increases turbidity, which also inhibits the light penetration. And floating plants also block sunlight. So when you have these huge mats of floating plants, no sunlight is getting through, all of your submerged vegetation underneath is going to suffer. So I included this. These are the recent Lake Okeechobee water levels. So our ecologically preferred range for Lake Okeechobee is between 12 feet and 15.5 feet, with, you know, amounts staying at the bottom, having, you know, low periods and also having high periods, but the key is having low periods for a short amount of time and having high periods for a short amount of time. It's when these high periods stay high for too long is when you start seeing a loss of both submerged and emergent vegetation. So can you stop spraying during spawning and hunting season? This is something I hear a lot, and I totally understand from the perspective of an angler or hunter that, you know, having an airboat in the area is very disturbing, and it's something that I've worked with them a lot on. I've created this map. This map was actually created with the intention of spawning season, but I've also worked with waterfowl hunters during the current season too, to make sure that I'm aware of these areas that are important to them, that they think are highly productive. So my intention is to clean up these areas as much as possible beforehand, and then try to limit contractor presence as much as possible. So far through waterfowl season, I've been successful with that. I've been able to stay out of some of these high priority areas and let these guys do their thing. So another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that we don't just treat floating plants on Lake Okeechobee. We treat a variety of species. Unfortunately, Lake Okeechobee is kind of a hotspot for all of these different species. These are just some of them that I've mentioned here. So a lot of the times too, I'll get stakeholders contact me and say, oh, I saw a guy spraying, but I didn't see anything. He was, you know, it looked like he was spraying the grass or looked like he was just spraying the water. But a lot of the times they're treating these other species that folks may not know how to recognize. So, you know, we have a lot of invasive grasses and things that look like they're native, like this lily pad. Here's another invasive grass. This one's fun because it's super tiny. This is a Zola pinnata. So this is something where if someone's spraying, you might not even see anything in the water. And this is another invasive grass, and this is another one as well. So we're treating a variety of plants, unfortunately, out there pretty much all the time. So with that, I just wanted to leave up my contact information, and again, encourage anyone to reach out with me or reach out to me if they have any questions or concerns. Like I said, my door is always open for, you know, I go out with stakeholders all the time. I'm always down to, you know, talk about it further.
Thank you. Does anyone on the committee have questions? Brandon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mariah, good to see you again. It was great to go out with Commissioner Kellum and yourself and some of our staff. I'm losing track of time, how long ago that was, maybe a month or so ago, out on the lake, and we took a look at the spray program. And, that was initiated by a phone call from a county commissioner up in Okeechobee County that called me and said, oh, people are telling me they're dumping chemical in the lake and, they're spraying open water and all those things. And then I called Commissioner Kellum, and then he got everybody together, and we went out and quickly understood how that's not happening as you just described. And, from what I saw, we would come up, as we would come up behind some of the guys with Applied Aquatic spraying. They didn't know we were there. And we would kind of observe and see what they were doing, and we'd pull up and talk, and had an opportunity to talk with one of the gentlemen from Applied Aquatics, and he gave us like a 3-minute dissertation on what he was doing. And the cool thing to me is he was like so excited about what he was doing. He was like totally into it, passionate about what he was doing. I think you told me, Mariah, there was like 20 boats, I think, on average on the lake in a day. Is that right?
Correct, but right now I'm looking at only between like 10 and 14, just at, the availability that the guys have right now.
Okay. Just a couple quick things. In the 100-gallon tank, I believe you described to me, that's on the airboats. Can you tell me again how much chemical is in that 100-gallon tank?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because that's also a good thing to talk about. So the two most common chemicals I use are flumioxazin and panoxylum. So for flumi, that's a plant that we use to target water lettuce, and it's highly selective, so they're able to spray that, in cattail and bulrush, and it doesn't harm the natives, it just gets the lettuce. And we only use 3 ounces per acre, so that means that they're only using 3 ounces of chemical mixed in with 100 gallons of water. So this chemical is very heavily diluted when it actually comes out.
And as you described, just for the committee's sake, they clean the tank out 2 or 3 times a day as part of the normal protocol of having to flush that tank. So some people may see somebody turning a tank and it looks like there's chemical pouring out, but that's just, it's 99% water. You've got this highly concentrated chemical in there, and they have to flush the tank as a part of their daily procedure a couple times a day. Is that right? Did I understand that right?
Yes, correct. At the end of the day, they do have to clean all their equipment and everything. So after they finish spraying the tank, then they'll fill it up a few times each with 100% water, and then, very little residue still inside, and then that's what they will spray out at the end of the day.
And then the other thing, Madam Chair, that I thought was really interesting when she was talking about the shedding from the larger plants, and people say, oh, well, they're just spraying open water. Well, no, they're spraying, they're so small at the time they're hitting it and killing it, which is the whole point. So they don't get large and they shed and have all that. They're actually killing vegetation that they need to take care of. It's just not large enough maybe for the guy that's at the boat 50 yards down the way, he can't see it. So they're just like, oh, they're just spraying open water. Well, no, they're actually doing what they need to do, and that was definitely helpful for me. My last question would be, Mariah, from your perspective, we were talking about preferred levels on the lake, and you probably heard we've got this big discussion coming up with the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. That's going to be a big thing that's going to be talked about in 2019. In your opinion, holding the lake artificially low down to 10 feet or so, would that be beneficial for the lake?
I don't think so, depending on the amount of time that it's kept that way. So I don't think that anything very low is good, but I also don't think anything very high is good either. And like I mentioned, it's this effect of, I think it's fine for it to ping pong down, it's fine for it to ping pong up, but if you hold it at either side, you're not gonna have, the lake does need droughts every now and then. I mean, we're definitely due for a drought. We had high water events in 2015 and 16, which caused very significant vegetation loss on top of having Irma. So we're definitely due for low, but I think having that be a regular thing would not be good.
So the lake, as long as it breathes, as we have these high times, natural low times, that natural breathing, we certainly don't want to knock the wind out of it and suffocate it. So I'm not putting words in your mouth, but I believe that that's what I'm hearing, not just from you, but from other people like Dr. Gray. It's important that the lake have that balance. We had these high water times. Hopefully we're going to have some drought times now that gives us that relief that we can burn and do the things that we're talking about. But it sounds to me that it's certainly not a good idea to force the lake down to artificially low levels, because that could certainly cause a lot of ecological harm. So I appreciate all that you're doing.
Right, yeah, our recommendation as an agency is for it to be kept between 12 and 15 and a half feet.
Jamie?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Dr. Tucker over here giving us a biology lesson over here. But I do appreciate the analogy of the lake being a living body, and the fact that it needs to raise and lower naturally, and it has benefits on both sides. I appreciate your presentation, very informative. In the farming business, we we have scouts that help us plan out our spray programs, that go out and look at what types of diseases we're seeing in the fields and what type of pest pressure we're seeing. Who does that for you guys? Are you the scout, or do you have a few folks that do that? Do you allow your contractors to do that? Does your plan change from week to week based on what you're seeing out there? Is that how that works?
Yeah, unfortunately, because these plants move, I mean, it could change within 24 hours. You know, you could have a day when the Kissimmee River dumps a bunch of plants over the weekend, and suddenly I have 500 more acres than I thought on the north end. But to answer your question, yes, I'm the one that does it primarily. Like I mentioned, we do our helicopter surveys every month, which is really helpful. You know, we use a district helicopter for that. We go up, we get a really great bird's eye view, and it gives us a really good idea of exactly what I'm looking at. But yes, it changes all the time, and that's where the contractors are, you know, really good about being able to know, you know, we stay in contact all the time. I could send them to a point and say, hey, there's, you know, 20 acres, you need to go over here and treat, and they'll call me and say, I'm not seeing anything. You know, that happened the other day. They were at Ritta Island, and they said, there's nothing out here. What do you want us to do? So it's just a matter of taking it day by day. These plants are just floating, and they go everywhere, so it's really hard to predict.
Thank you. Sounds very similar to what we do.
Okay, thank you for both of your comments, and Brandon, that's very helpful, and I have seen the contractors out, and I know a couple of them personally, and I know these guys do a really good job, and I know you are watching it constantly, and I also know that this isn't an issue that has a one answer, you know, bang, we can get this done. It's not a one solution problem. This is something that's going to take a multi-pronged approach. I guess my question, I have a couple questions, but we'll start with, how many years has the spray program been going? What do you, since you see this every day, what do you think the success rate has been in preventing or really pushing this back? I mean, are we winning this battle with these invasive exotics, or are we just continuing to just spray what comes up and it's just going to be an ongoing thing? Do you think that you're doing less acres every year, or?
No. I mean, to be honest, these plants are not going anywhere. You know, people ask me, oh, well, is eradication possible? No. I mean, on a lake the size of Okeechobee, and with how long hyacinth and lettuce has been around, these plants reproduce vegetatively and by seed. So there are millions of seeds probably in the marsh just waiting to propagate, and the same with, you know, these plants reproducing vegetatively. All it takes is one plant to just explode. I mean, water hyacinth can double in size in 7 to 10 days. It is insane at how quickly these plants can get out of control. So unfortunately, I mean, we're winning the battle on a day-to-day basis, but if it's anything that we stop doing, if the moratorium taught us anything, it's that we cannot afford to let off on this at all.
Has anyone looked into a spray that sterilizes the plant so that it can't seed?
I'm not sure about that.
That would be interesting to go to University of Florida with and find out if they can work on something like that. The other question I have, and I don't know if you can answer it or maybe Terry wants to weigh in, but, you know, going back to what Jamie was saying in the previous presentation with the fire, you know, and I guess it just brings up this question for me, and I completely understand what you're saying. We cannot let up on letting this, it cannot go back the way it was. So I just want to preface all of this with this. But I think that there's so many things at play here. We can't ignore some of the negative effects because of the positive. So I'm no way criticizing you or your efforts or your guys or anything like that. But I think that some of these issues need to be talked about, even though they're hard questions to ask and they're hard answers to try to find an answer to. I still think we have to talk about it. You know, we have legacy phosphorus at the bottom of this lake, right? And that phosphorus level keeps going up. And we have issues with those nutrients going out into estuaries and bleeding into our other waterways. And I guess it just leads me to think, okay, well, if we've got all this organic matter going down to the bottom of the lake from the spraying, you know, are we then contributing more to the phosphorus that's in the lake? And has anyone thought about how do you quantify that, and how do you address that? There's really no way to address that, so we're really kind of chasing our tail here. You want to try, Terry?
I don't know that I can answer that as far as the quantification, but there's a couple different issues. One of the things that we saw and we experienced after Hurricane Irma is we have that deep pool of kind of reservoir of oozy phosphorus-laden material, and that actually can move a bit around the lake, but it's concentrated in the deeper portions of the lake. And so what we saw with Hurricane Irma, and we'll see it in January, February, March, just when it's really windy on the lake, that material, it's really not muck, it's very unconsolidated kind of flock, we call it. And that gets stirred up, and that contributes to the turbidity as well as the phosphorus levels. I think one of the concerns that we've had with the consequences of the organic material from spraying falling out into the lake, it's more in those nearshore areas, and it's really an issue when it comes to fish spawning. Out in the center of the lake is a different issue. That's kind of the flock material. It's in the nearshore area where it builds up and you've got muck and it's not suitable spawning locations. And so that's one of the big concerns. We do have plans that we've kind of have on the shelf based on a lake stage plan, funding necessarily, but if we get to the point that we're experiencing drought conditions, we know at certain stage elevations there are habitat improvement projects we can undertake, and if we reach those stages, we would come back to the board and say, looks like we're going to be heading down towards elevation, 11 and a half or 11. Here are some projects we might want to be gearing up for. We had a pretty significant effort with FWC and other agencies back in 2006 and 2007 to do muck scraping and removal. We probably hit the bulk of the ones that we could get to effectively. The challenge with that is similar to the plant material, is what do you do with that material once you scrape it up? It's very labor intensive and you have to have a disposal site, but we do have plans kind of set aside of here's what we would do at these different elevations, and it might entail additional burning as well as muck removal.
Well, we had worked with, in the Lake Worth Lagoon, they've created, they do muck capping, and it's been a really successful program, and I would love to see some of that happen on Lake Okeechobee, especially as breaks down by like the Pahokee Marina. I think we can strategically use some of our problems to be some of the solutions that we need. We just need to sort of learn from other areas that are doing that. We work with FWC on the Lake Worth Lagoon. It's been a fantastic project. They use barges to move that material, and then they capped it with sand, and it's beautiful. And they've created some great habitat, and they've created breaks in the lagoon, and it's just been a really, really successful thing. So I would love to see us sort of think outside the box a little bit more, whatever agencies need to collaborate on doing those things, because I feel like even though this is working to some degree, you're still going back to the same spot. I just wonder, how often do you go back to the same spot?
The lake's funny because there's areas that just for some reason the plants just flock there. Obviously it depends on winds and things. But no, I mean, you'll see a band of treated green, treated brown plants, and then you'll see a band of green stuff that has flown in within 24 hours. So it is running around putting out fires.
And so you mentioned that some of it floats down the Kissimmee. Do we have a big issue on the Kissimmee River as well? And is that being sprayed? And is there a way to do some kind of barriers, like water barriers, to sort of trap it and treat it and try to quarantine it from getting into the lake? I mean, are there other methods that we could be exploring, even though, like, I understand, and a lot of people do prefer the mechanical harvesting. I think that there are places that could be done, and they could utilize barges and things like that. And I know that it's more expensive, but I think that if we could work in conjunction and look at all the tools in the toolbox, because even though the spraying is working at keeping it at bay, if it's a constant thing and we just have to keep spraying all the time, I'm not sure that that's, in my opinion, a sustainable future. I would love to see a multi-pronged approach to how are we able to measure over a period of time a percentage, even if it's 10%, which is pretty high, of, reduction each year. That would be my goal, is a 10% reduction every year. I think it's pretty ambitious, even the 10. Don't you agree?
Yeah, so I also manage the river, Kissimmee River, and that is just kind of a wild card as far as, you know, with the restoration area opening up hundreds of new acres of floodplain, that's definitely been a challenge. But I have applied aquatic going up there pretty much. We survey it every other flight. So every other month we'll pretty much go all the way up the river and see all the plants and everything in there, and then send them up kind of on a case by case basis. But as far as putting in any kind of like barrier or anything because of flood control, we are not able to do that. It just pretty much comes down. But no, I definitely try to get it before it gets to the lake, especially because it can, like I mentioned, it flows over the weekend, overnight sometimes. So, I'm constantly having them do the Harney Pond Canal, the Indian Prairie Canal, Upper Taylor Creek, Kissimmee River, Caloosahatchee. I mean, there are just, the places that these plants are coming from are all over, so.
It's good job security, for sure, for those sprayers. I think we also have to recognize that because we're unable to really muck scrape, we're not able to pull muck off the bottom because you can't do anything with it, even though people would love to take it. It's, we're never gonna get a permit to have it leave shoreline. So I guess the concern is that this organic matter on top of everything else is just continuing to make the bottom of the lake higher and higher and higher, and so it just, again, it's sort of like this hamster wheel of, okay, we're gonna manage the lake and have a lure schedule and how much water is okay, but then the bottom keeps rising, so you're constantly, it's a moving target all the time. And I think, I'm saying this I'm not trying to be argumentative or anything, I'm saying this just to get it out there in the public, because I don't think a lot of people realize that there's so many factors to managing this lake in so many ways. And I think it's not talked about enough that there's so many things against us that we're trying to just catch up to. And so I think that that's why it's good to talk about this and try to get new ideas. I would love for somebody to get in touch with UF and see if we can't find someone that can design, a spray that actually will sterilize these plants, because I think that could actually be beneficial. If it's not going to be able to breed, then maybe you could knock it back a little bit more. I'm gonna read a few emails that I got for public comment on this. You can choose to respond if you want. These were people that email me all the time. I belong to no less than 3 recreation groups online that, it's a constant conversation, the spraying. And I will tell you, I appreciate the misconceptions. Most of the guys I talk to don't say any of that stuff, but, I think they're just all concerned, and the greatest part about having recreation on our properties and on state lands and publicly owned lands is that people take ownership. And I find that that's the best thing we can ever ask for in anybody that's recreating on any lands that are owned by the government, is that everybody that's out there take an ownership stake, because you can't be everywhere. And I will share your information with everyone that has emailed me. But I do want to read some of their comments, because they have taken the time to email me, and then I want to talk about the meeting and the petition against the spraying that's going on as well.
I just wanted to say too that I totally agree with you that, I really do, even though sometimes they are upset when they contact me, I really encourage it, and it's really helpful to me. I'm not a waterfowl hunter, I'm not an angler, I don't know what areas are important or what's not, and, as a section, we can always do more education, we can always be out there more. I think that education is really the base of where a lot of these issues are coming from. So I'm always willing to have these conversations if anyone has any ideas of where we could be at, to get more education information out. I think that, that would be really helpful to all of us too.
Yeah, I think so too, and trust me, I can relate. You can't make everybody happy.
Yeah.
You're going to get nasty grams, and I apologize. I get them all the time, so. But, that's, again, this is why I wanted to have this at this meeting, because I really wanted to, there's a lot of people that gripe about this and that and the other, and so I like to just bring it up. Let's have an open forum about it, let's discuss it, let's talk about it. They're gonna watch, they're gonna listen. I'm gonna get them back information that, I learned here today. And then we try to all, be on the same page, going toward the same goals. So that's really the purpose of this discussion. So the first email is from Chuck Eschanique. I'm writing to you over deep concerns with the current state of our lakes in Florida and rampant overspraying and aggressive treatment of subaquatic vegetation, specifically in the Kissimmee chain of lakes and Lake Okeechobee. I'm an avid outdoorsman, certified wildlife biologist, and active private lands wildlife manager. As a sixth-generation native Floridian, I've been fishing, boating, and hunting since I was old enough to barely walk. Over the course of my nearly 50 years, I've watched our state systematically destroy our lakes and waterways with increasingly more aggressive chemical treatment of hydrilla and other aquatic vegetation. So there you go. There's a misconception about spraying hydrilla, and you're saying that you don't spray hydrilla.
I don't spray hydrilla in Okeechobee, so he mentioned the Kissimmee chain of lakes. I know that they do spray on the Kissimmee chain of lakes.
Okay. The result is no less than the complete eutrophication, of our lakes and river systems. One only need look at lakes like Istopoga and Hancock to see the devastation caused by such aggressive practices. Just a mere 7 years ago, Lake Istopoga was one of the best bass fishing and waterfowl hunting lakes in all of Florida. The water was mostly clear, and there was a diversity of vegetation that functioned as cover, food, and filtration for the lake. There was an abundance of cattails, spatterdock, Kissimmee grass, pickerel weed, ringtail grass, hydrilla, duckweed, nutsedge, hyacinth, water lily, and other plants that provide for a beautiful and healthy lake. In 2012, FWC began a more aggressive spraying campaign to rid the lake of hydrilla and clear the shorelines of cattails. By 2016, the lake was a milky brown color, void of most vegetation and all of the many bird species that wintered on it. The lake looks like a cesspool. All of the thousands of ducks that once wintered there have gone and won't return. The frogs that were abundant are nearly non-existent. Bottom-feeding invasive species like armored catfish are beginning to populate the lake. It's become so eutrophic that even a complete cessation of spraying will not bring it back to what it was. The muck layer of decaying plant matter now sitting at the bottom of the lake is so thick that only a drawdown and scraping of the lake bed could even begin the slow and lengthy recovery of this once sportsman's hidden gem. Lake Hancock is even worse. The muck lake of decaying vegetation is more than 6 feet deep in many places. Even with the completion of the filtration marsh at the south end of the lake itself remains all but dead. The same fate is beginning to take place on other lakes in the Kissimmee chain. Lake Kissimmee, Lake Toho, Lake Cypress, and Lake Hatchinaw are all suffering the same fate. If we don't cease these practices and begin to reverse them immediately, we'll only see more and more of the horrific algae blooms which we experienced this summer at Lake Okeechobee. Eventually, and sooner rather than later, Lake Okeechobee too will become so eutrophic that it will also cease to support wildlife. The process is already well underway. When you combine the aggressive spraying and the treatment of SAVs with unregulated residential fertilizer use, rampant runoff, exponential population growth, and the development of our aging and outdated infrastructure, it's clear to see the direness of the situation. We're already late to the party and have a lot to do to catch up. Please, I ask you to bring together the various state agencies in charge of our waterways and lakes in Central and South Florida to quickly work toward a solution to this devastation, especially FWC, our water management districts, and the United States Army Corps of Engineers. The longer inaction occurs, the faster we race toward the complete collapse of this critical watershed. All of Florida can ill afford to remain complacent any longer. The overspraying and aggressive chemical treatment has to stop. And this was Chuck Eschanique, Foundation of Balanced Environmental Stewardship, and he's a member of FWC's Waterfowl, Deer, Black Bear, and Alligator Technical Assistant Group in Tampa. And again, this is just like public comment. These people could not be here today. Here's another one from Mr. Rich Andrews. Thanks for your interest you have expressed in getting control over the spraying of the lakes. I have about 38 years on Lake Okeechobee and own a house in Moorhaven, Florida. It is our weekend getaway, and we used to frog fish and hunt just about every weekend. I have not been alone on these trips, as 24 other families from Fort Lauderdale have purchased second homes in Moorhaven for the same reasons as stated above. My recreational activities on Lake Istopoga and a few other places, as well as my core group of friends, has dwindled down to far less than half of what it used to be like. Just think of our little economic impact we have had on just one town with the lack of buying of gas, ice, drinks, etc. The small towns are dying a slow death, all due to the conditions of these bodies of water. The needless amounts of chemicals being dumped into our ecosystem is appalling. we see on a regular basis an all-out attack on all kinds of SAV, native and non-native, on Lake Okeechobee. I kid with my wife how even the ditches alongside 27 from the Holy Lands past the new FEB are sprayed all the time. Why and where does that watershed flow to? Straight into the glades. And they wonder why native islands and vegetation are disappearing. As a matter of fact, my son and I were sprayed on Lake Okeechobee by a helicopter who didn't see us in our airboat as we duck hunted in the hayfield just northeast of the Moorhaven Canal. It was then that I took this personally, as no agency would admit or claim to have sanctioned a spray operation that day, but a 7-year-old will tell you differently. The people benefiting from this will sit here and tell you we don't target this and we don't do that. Well, what happened to all the hydrilla on Istapoga? How does one target 3,000 acres of hydrilla without it leaching into an entire body of water? It is so obvious what is going on here, yet a lot of people won't admit why we are seeing what we are witnessing on all these bodies of water, who will be held responsible. And it goes on. Another one, what's happening at the lake, it's dying from overspraying. I'm not a biologist, but I'm an avid sportsman, and I urge you to please look at what's going on. And then obviously, we've seen that there's a petition going around about banning spraying. They want to ban the spraying altogether. So, you know, I think that, in my personal opinion, we have a discussion that's overdue. We have a lot of misinformation, obviously, but I think that the people that wrote in and had those experiences, those were real experiences for them, you know, and it's unfortunate. And so I think that getting more education out there, talking to the user groups, really getting them engaged, trying to find a more multi-pronged approach to this instead of just a continual spraying. And I can appreciate the 3 ounces per 100 gallons and all of that, and I completely understand that. But I think that when you read, this is just a couple of the hundreds of comments and emails that I have seen of people's personal experiences, whether they're misinformed or you know, confused, but that's their personal experience, and that's something that's really, they're really passionate about. And I can tell you, when I go fishing with my husband, I get very upset when I see that biomass. I mean, it looks like chocolate milk. And places that we have enjoyed fishing, there's no longer any fish. And it's frustrating. And so I share their frustration, but I don't think there's any silver bullet solution, but I think that we need to encourage that conversation. And I appreciate the one gentleman's suggestion that we continue to have a multi-agency approach to keeping that conversation going about just not getting, we don't want to get stuck in, well, this is keeping it at bay, so let's just keep doing that. Let's push ourselves to figure out, how do we do this better? How can we get to looking for a 5-year period or a 10-year period where you're getting a percentage reduction every year? How can we target that and get over this? If we can eradicate Melaleuca in South Florida, I think that we can, you know, try to find a targeted approach to have a better solution for this other than just continue to spray. Because I think that those other issues are going to be coming around sooner than later, you know, with increased phosphorus on the lake and things like that with the biomass. So that's just my personal opinions, and I appreciate you letting me, indulging me to read some of the emails, and if anyone has any more comments, and if you want to comment, I really appreciate you coming today. I don't want to beat you up. I'm not trying to, we're definitely not trying to be, you know, adversarial here. I just wanted to really talk about this in depth, and I appreciate that you gave such a great presentation, and I will encourage everybody to reach out, and maybe we can do another workshop up in Okeechobee. Maybe there could be a way to do it during, you know, some of the events that are going on. Maybe those sportsmen could host FWC at some of their events, and so that people can talk to you guys individually, because I think that's really where you get the minds changed and you get a partnership with these people, is if they can look you in the face and have those conversations as well.
Yeah, and we are looking to reschedule our postponed public meeting, probably around like late January sometime. So you know, that's kind of, I think it's like the fourth one in this series now, to just encourage people to come talk to us. But I did just want to respond to the complaint about the guy saying he got sprayed by a helicopter and then how no one wanted to take credit for it. We are in no way trying to hide anything we do. Everything, the money we spend, the herbicide we use, everything can be available online. Nothing we're doing is in the dark. Like I said, I mean, we can provide any information anyone wants, but I do, you know, I agree with you that whether their experiences are correct or not, they're still experiences that we need to work on, so.
I would imagine if you were in an airboat and you were duck hunting, you'd be pretty well camouflaged, and no one would see you even
Well,
from the
right, yeah,
helicopter.
but him saying that no one said that they were spraying that day, you know, that we really try to go out of our way to make sure everyone, you know, we just did an aerial treatment, so we really went out of our way to know I'm out there on the water for 9 hours doing nothing but sitting out there flagging people down and telling them we're out there. So, you know, we really do
Yeah.
try to make sure that everyone is aware of what
Well,
we're
and I
doing.
think it goes back to what Martha was saying, you know, how did these guys learn? And I think that's another education thing where you say, you know, and I don't know what it says on FWC. I've just grown up here, so I know what to check for, but I don't know if there is a place when if you're a new license, if you're going in
Right.
as a new person or a non-resident, or even just it's your first time getting a hunting license, you know, could there be a section, or is there even a section that says, hey, by the way, you know, you might want to check here. We have land resources and land management going on all the time. You might want to check here to see if where you plan to go is impacted by any of our normal land management practices. And it could be something as simple as that to educate new people, or even people that just hadn't thought about it. Because as we have to manage all these lands, I think we just have to keep that education going, and it could be as simple as just adding that to the website,
Right.
where they could have a hyperlink to your section, and then they could check where they're gonna go hunt. So it could be as simple as that, Martha.
I mean, working with FWC, we see we could, you know, establish a link. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea, yeah. I don't think people think about that, so it'd be great. Well, I think it's tough. I think that would be tough to do just because of what she's saying. It's such a fluid thing, and you're doing it on a weekly basis. That would be really tough. But I think encouraging people to use a website, I mean, when we go fishing, we check the weather, and then I'll check to see what's going on in the area that we think we're gonna fish in, whether it's being burned or sprayed, so I know where I'm gonna go. I mean, maybe there's not a lot of people to that detail, but we would encourage that, I guess, you know? I mean, that's what happens when you're in a highly managed ecosystem, is that we have to sort of maybe start training people and educating people that you are recreating in a highly managed system. And this is what, you know, we suggest you do to make sure that you have the best experience possible.
Well, there's one thing I know that we've started here at the district, I can get with Dwayne and we can work with FWC, but there's a notification system platform we're actually testing here for issues that might arise that the staff here needs to know. Maybe that's something where it sends out a text message, and right now we're prototyping where you can sign up for it, put your phone number in it, and we have these canned messages that go out automatically. Maybe that's something we can work with FWC and see if we can partnership on something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, or even just Twitter. You know, I think a lot of hunters subscribe to the FWC Twitter and to our Twitter. And so, you know I see the tweets from you guys when you're burning and things like that. So, yeah, I think just utilizing what we have at our disposal and then just making people aware that, you know, they need to be recognizing, again, you're in a highly managed ecosystem and it's here for you to recreate on, but we want you to be safe and we want you to have a great experience. And so if they're burning in one area, avoid that area. If they're spraying in another area. And I know it's hard because, like you said, it's a moving target. So knowing where you're going to spray tomorrow is probably not the same as what you're looking at today, right?
Yeah, I mean, usually like I said, I make it at the, usually I'll send it out on Friday. But yeah, I know it can change, and it changes on, weather. The lake can be windy on the north end, but not on the south end, so that's going to determine, where they go that day, and then just the guys they have available. So there's just a lot going on. And, we take into account bass tournaments too. If a tournament comes up, I try to pull them out of certain areas or pull them off altogether.
Great. Well, good. I appreciate the discussion. I think that that's really was my, my goal today, was just that we talk openly about solutions and concerns and get some of the misinformation dealt with. So I really appreciate you coming, Mariah.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for having me.
Any other public comments? Mr. Quashis.
Okay. First of all, thank you for what you're doing.
Pete, can you go to the podium so we can get you on the microphone?
Thank you very much, Mariah. Appreciate your efforts. There's some action that could be taken. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to present to the RAC. If not, you should do so, and should do so regularly. That reaches this is like singing to the choir here. I mean, we already understand what we're talking about. Angler Action Foundation, which used to be the Stook Foundation, has an active outreach. We have a website, we're on Twitter accounts, we got all that stuff. This is where you would expect sportsmen to go. And of course, Newton Cook and his United Waterfowlers has a very active page. Much of the negative comment comes from those people, but at the same time, this is an educational function that we can go forward with. Lee County has had an active program for many years using grass carp, white amur, to help control. I don't know if you've explored that in larger bodies of water and whether that has any potential or not. If not, it's one of those tools in the toolbox that can be used. It was interesting, as those fish got bigger and bigger, they sometimes became predaceous, so they stopped eating grass. They'd take a lure once in a while. You'd think you had a big redfish, but it is what it is. So we're more than willing to cooperate with you. I think you have an important message. I think there is a win-win here. The problem is not going to go away. We are talking about warmer water. We're talking about more water. We're talking about more nutrients. Guess what? We're going to have more grass. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you for standing up and doing it.
Yes.
So I have presented at the RAC, but if that's something that you feel like my regular appearance would be beneficial, I can totally do that. Yes, Newton Cook and I talk all the time. He definitely fills me in on stuff. And the grass carp situation, grass carp are great for smaller water bodies. We actually use them a lot we have a grass carp program. We use them mostly for retention ponds and things when people don't want any vegetation. But unfortunately for Okeechobee, they aren't selective. They wouldn't just get what we're trying to get, and they actually don't even go after floating plants. So yeah, we would love if something like that could work out. But
Where's your funding come from? Who's paying for it?
our funding comes from, so it goes to the state, and then the state decides. So the legislature in Tallahassee, decides on a yearly basis, and our funding was actually cut this year, just depending on the needs of the state and what's going on with there. So I did want to talk about, we do use, we partner with the USDA to do biocontrol. We work with them a lot to release bugs on the lake. So, that's part of, Rory mentioned our integrated method. So that's something that we're currently trying to do. They don't make a huge impact, but that's another partnership that we have, trying to look at other ways to go about it. So, yeah.
Super. I'm going to get, if somebody, maybe Rosie could do this, or Yvette, I'm sorry, could give us, if you can send me a link, and actually if we could just get the whole board copied on a link to this presentation. And then what I'll do, Mariah, is I'll put this on the group pages so that they can click on the link and read through it. And then if they have questions, and maybe some of the groups would want to talk to you or have you come to some of their meetings, there could be more of a conversation had there, and then we can just get this message out to more people. And so I'll go ahead and get that link, and then everybody else will have the link as well. This way, if they get the same kinds of comments, then we all have the same information. Okay? Oh, Joel?
Could Francois come up and give you a little more information?
Sure. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Francois LaRoche, Radiation Management Section. Just wanted to give you a little bit of history, since you mentioned history. The district has been doing this type of work since I've started here back in the early 90s, and in the 70s, 80s, the district was controlling water hyacinth and other plants in the lakes. In the 1990s, we turned that over to the Corps of Engineers, And back in the early 2000s, then it went to FWC. We've been cooperating with the University of Florida since then. Dr. Haller from the Center for Aquatic Plants, where I used to work 30 years ago, has done a lot of studies on how to deal with water hyacinth. They've used laser, boil water. I was involved in the studies and looking at the effect of leaving a pond full of water hyacinth, not treating it, and treating a pond and not letting the plant grow, and look at the difference in the amount of biomass that sinks. And that's how they determined that less plant, the better. So that's why we always try to spray so we can have less plant as possible. So the key really is to not have to spray, and if you spray the plant, don't let them grow. That's the problem. But when you have conflicting interests where the hunters want some plants, the fishermen want plants, so we're not able to maintain those lake levels as low as possible, and that's the problem. And the key is definitely education, because in the past we had the state steering committee, the aquatic plant steering committee that came from the state that coordinated all that, which we don't have anymore. So that may be something we do, and is to bring that back so we can coordinate with all the agencies throughout the state to bring attention to the problem. So
That's a great idea. So Francois, who do we call about sterilization?
sterilization, that's not easily done. That's a lot of genetics you have to do to get to that point. But water hyacinth we produce is every 14 days. So every 14 days you double the mass. So there's a lot of improvement that's been made in the herbicide technology. Back in the days, we used to have two herbicides, 2,4-D and diquat. Now we have flumioxazin, we have pinoxylin, we have all these other herbicides that are very selective. So in the past, we used to go out and treat, you kill the bulrush, you kill the cattail. Now you can go and selectively kill the water hyacinth and leave the bulrush alone. So there's a lot of improvement made with the technology and less herbicide being used. We are using 2 to 4 quarts of 2,4-D. Now we're using ounces of herbicide. So there's a lot of improvement that have been made. But, you know, and Maria mentioned biocontrol. The district has been very supportive of the USDA looking at biocontrol, but unfortunately we've not had one insect that can control the plant. But we're still cooperating with the University of Florida, and they're very aware of the situation, and they're still looking into better technology to take care of the problem.
Great.
But the problem, you know, most invasive plant, that's the education we have to put out there. Invasive plants are a problem.
It's tough.
And they will continue to grow if we don't take care of them. So,
Thanks, Francois.
all right.
Good. All right, thanks for indulging. Okay, at this point, we're going to have a special workshop about the Western Everglades Restoration Project. So at this point, I will open the workshop. I'm glad that we're continuing the process today of receiving more detailed information on the complex projects for which the board is responsible for making policy decisions. This is a great opportunity for us to have a detailed exchange of ideas and have an open dialogue about our concerns. So now I'll call Mindy Parrott, lead project manager, and Jennifer Leeds, section administrator.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about WARP today. As you mentioned, back in August, we had a governing board presentation about WARP, and it was suggested that we come back and discuss WARP as a special workshop so that we could have more discussion, have more time for discussion. I'm going to present the basics about the project today, and then Jennifer is going to talk about some of the policy issues that the team has been challenged with. So today's objectives are to provide you with an overview of the WARP project and to get your input and guidance on our current alternative, as well as some of the policy issues that we've been working on since August. So first, I would like to talk about the study area. It's a rather large area of about 1,200 square miles. Let me point out a few landmarks for you in the photo on the left. So here's Lake Okeechobee that we just spent time talking about treatment on. And down on the south end, we have Everglades National Park. US 41 is right about here, Tamiami Trail. And then Alligator Alley would be I-75 right about in here. You can see on the map that we have lands belonging to the Seminole Tribe of Florida. The Big Cypress Seminole Indian Reservation is in orange, and in yellow is the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida Alligator Alley Reservation. Also within the study area is a large part of Big Cypress National Preserve and Water Conservation Area 3A. So the landscape in the study area was historically dominated by wetlands, and that's still the case in a large portion of the southern part of the study area. But today we see a lot of agriculture in the northern area. So why WIRP and why now? WIRP is part of the larger Everglades restoration vision, and it includes key components of SERP. These components complement other SERP projects such as SEP. During the SEP planning, both tribes expressed the need and urgency to address the flows and water quality on the western side of the Everglades. That brought the project up further on the integrated delivery schedule. So that's how we got here today. We believe that the work plan that we're working on addresses many of the tribes, both of the tribes' concerns, and I'll point those out to you later in the presentation. So work kicked off in August of 2016. It incorporated data that we collected from the state's Western Basin's Water Resource Evaluation Study, but we soon identified that additional data was needed to update and expand the regional model into the study area. So a budget and schedule waiver was approved in January of this year, actually, and extended the schedule to 46 months and a budget of $6.7 million. We're looking to select a TSP, a tentatively selected plan, in March of this coming year. So the larger objectives of WIRP are to restore quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of flows, extend hydro periods, reestablish connectivity, reestablish ecological resilience, improve water quality, and improve system-wide operational flexibility. To understand how these objectives apply to the WIRP study area, we need to zoom in and look at the western basins. So I'll point out a few things on the screen. The western basins include the C-139, the feeder canal basin, the C-139 annex, the L-28, and the L-28 gap. Major feature of this part of the CNSF system is the L-28 interceptor canal, this canal right here. It collects water from the feeder basin from the north feeder canal here and the west feeder canal here. And it sends that water, let me try a different one. Sends that water down the canal and releases it into Conservation Area 3A over here within the Miccosukee Reservation. So I wanted to point out some of the issues that the tribes have indicated are big concerns to them. The first is the Seminole tribes are very concerned about these flows going through the reservation and the quality of the water. They're also concerned about their native area, which is very important to them culturally and ecologically, and they feel like it's been adversely affected by the CNSF system. Also, the Big Cypress National Preserve has been affected by the system through over-drainage, which can result in more frequent and devastating wildfires. So while the L-28 provided flood protection, has also resulted in that over-drainage. And when it releases this water into the Miccosukee Reservation, because of the water quality, it has caused a very drastic change in vegetation. This is what the Miccosukees refer to as the halo. And there is another similar area off of S-140 from flows down the L-28 North Canal. So it's very, it's one of the Miccosukie's priorities to eliminate this release of water and improve the biological and vegetative condition in this area. They would also are very interested in seeing this area of the two canals where they intersect, which we refer to as the L-28 triangle, to have that part of the system removed, basically have the canal filled in and the levees pushed in. So we've heard that both tribes are concerned about water quality, and so is Big Cypress National Preserve, and so is the Water Management District and the other federal agencies as well. It's a large driver of the WRP project planning and development of the alternatives and siting of the project features. Flows for WRP are redirected in Big Cypress National Preserve, which is subject to the state's narrative nutrient criteria and is also an outstanding Florida water. I'm not going to read you the narrative nutrient criteria, but it is here in the slide. For planning purposes, DEP translated that narrative value, narrative standard and criteria into numeric values that we could use in planning, and we use those to size our water treatment facilities, our STAs for the project. So our strategy in planning has been to treat the flows upstream of all of these sensitive areas so that those targets may be met further downstream. So for plan formulation, we had a regional approach because of the large size of the study area, and we developed management measures that would address different issues in different areas. So some of those management measures were eliminated during early model runs because they didn't perform well. What we were left with was 3 alternatives in the final array, and those are the results that we talked about at the August governing board meeting. And I've got a graphic here. Don't worry, I'm not going to spend too much time on these tiny little pictures, but I do want to point out a few things about these alternatives which led to us developing our current alternative. So the blue arrows kind of represent the size of the flow area that the alternative is working with. So alternative 1R on the left side of the slide is working with flows that are coming from just the feeder canal basin itself, whereas the other 2 reach up into the C-139 basin, and in the case of alternative 3R, all the way up to the Caloosahatchee River to take excess flows from that system. The other thing I'd like to point out is all of these green shapes represent 1 or more stormwater treatment areas that would need to be constructed and to treat these flows. And the vast majority of those are on privately owned land that would have to be acquired by the district. We do have the opportunity to use some state-owned land on the C-139 annex, and you'll see that all of these alternatives do incorporate that, as well as our current alternative. At the southern end of the project, the alternatives are very similar. Some used passive measures, where others used more active measures. And one more thing to point out here, within this part of the L-28 intersector canal, some of the alterations that we had looked at in these 3 alternatives involved weirs that would discharge water from the canal into Big Cypress National Preserve. And there was a lot of risk involved with water quality coming out of the canal into the preserve, and so that was one of the reasons why we looked for another solution. So, as we discussed back in August, all three of these alternatives had issues and problems, not the least of which was cost and the requirement to purchase a lot of land in Hendry County. There was also complications for restoration strategies and the source control program in the C-139 basin if we were going to reroute flows from that area. There were some water quality issues. The tribes each had concerns with different parts of the different plans, and not all of the features in the plans had the ability for operational flexibility. So hearing the feedback from the August Governing Board meeting, the team went back and developed a hybrid alternative using bits and pieces from the existing array and tried to address the concerns while maintaining the benefits we were seeing from the project. So now I'm going to walk you through the major features of our current alternative and try to explain why it's our go-to and why we feel that it's our best bet right now. So if you recall, one of the major concerns of the Seminole tribe was the flows coming down the West Feeder and North Feeder canals. Our alternative reroutes flows going down the canal in two directions. First to the west, over here, and also to the east. On the west side, there is one STA, which will take water from this area and send it via sheet flow down into Big Cypress National Preserve via a flowway. And that water has the opportunity to travel into the natural area of the Seminole Indian Reservation. On the east side, the North Feeder Canal will be blocked. The water will enter a stormwater treatment area on state land and send the water through existing canals into the northwest corner of 3A. So we've effectively rerouted the water going down the L28 canal into these two flow paths. And we've also reduced the number and size of the STAs. That also reduces costs and the amount of land, of private land we'll have to purchase. So on number 3 here represents the alterations to the L28 interceptor. Because the flow is reduced, minimized down the canal, what's left is flows that are coming off the Seminole Indian Reservation itself. So we believe that our alternative will now eliminate the need to have any kind of weir or discharge structure from that canal into Big Cypress National Preserve. So we feel like our alternative has addressed a great many of the concerns of the Seminole tribe, and with the following features has also addressed the concerns of the Miccosukee. The L28 triangle area will be filled in and the levees removed, effectively restoring it to marsh and connecting the wetland inside of the triangle with the rest of the Everglades. On the south end of the system, the L28 tieback, which is this feature right here, currently that steers the water that's coming south in Big Cypress National Preserve, mostly to the east, into the Conservation Area 3. All of our plans have included a feature of removing this levee so that water can now flow south into the southern part of Big Cypress. The L28 South levee and canal serves to separate Water Conservation Area 3A from the south part of Big Cypress National Preserve, and we are proposing a series of structures as well as filling part of that canal So we can connect those two natural areas in a way that allows for operational flexibility. So what are the benefits that we expect to see with Alternative H? Well, improved water quality in Water Conservation Area 3 and in Big Cypress National Preserve, restoration flows to Big Cypress National Preserve and to the Seminole Tribe natural areas. And those are mostly up in the in these areas here. Reduced drainage in the northeast parts of Big Cypress National Preserve, which would help reduce the number of wildfires. Improved flow and connectivity between Big Cypress and Water Conservation Area 3A, and also this way, which is the historical path of the flow that's blocked by the levee. And we hope that what we're seeing in the model results is that there's the stages within Big Cypress are elevated slightly, and the stages in Water Conservation Area 3A are lowered slightly. And so we hope that that translates into reduced flooding of those tree islands that are seeing too high levels in the wet season. The full cost-benefit analysis will be done, we believe, in January, and we expect those benefits to be similar to Alternatives 1 and 3R based on model runs. And we hope to return to a governing board, hopefully in February, where we can describe those results in relationship to the other alternatives so you can see what they are, as well as look at the costs. So I'll turn it over to Jennifer to talk to you about the policy issues.
Good afternoon. Before I move on and talk about some of the policy issues that are facing the Western Everglades, I really want to highlight the importance of why we brought this project to Project Inlands today, from where we were back in the August governing board and where we're at in the plan formulation process. And the reason why it was important to bring it back to Project Inlands to not only give the board members additional information, but we're at a point in the plan formulation process where your input and guidance and thoughts on the approach that we've taken for the alternatives that we looked at back in August and some of the issues that we've had and are now, as we move forward to get to a tentatively selective plan, your input and feedback and guidance at this point will be incorporated as we move forward and select and get closer to that TSP. So we can incorporate that into our final discussions as we move forward with some of the optimized modeling that we want to do through the month of December. And so this is the time for your, again, your input on that to really have an influence on how this project is moving forward and also on the approach that we've taken to help resolve some of the critical policy items that we've had. So we have 3 critical policy issues that we're going to go over. But before we get there, when we were here in August, the board at that time directed us to go over to the BCB board and present over there on this project, since a large portion of this project takes place in Collier County and Big Cypress National Preserve. So we did that. We went over in October and presented this same material, went over what the project was, what it did, and some of the policy items. And the other thing is, you're very used to seeing projects that deal with Central Everglades, the lake, estuary discharges, and because Western Everglades is a little different and we're focusing on areas that are in Western Water Conservation Area 3A and Big Cypress National Preserve, we wanted to take a little bit of extra time to kind of reorient everyone to where some of these lands and we were talking about, but also the importance that this project has for the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program itself. This is a part of the CERP vision that went along with taking some of these central and southern flood control areas and decompartmentalizing and promoting some of that sheet flow, not only to the south, but a little bit more over to the west and providing these benefits to Big Cypress. So we presented this to the Big Cypress Basin Board. They had some positive things to say about the project. They questioned how we were handling some of the private lands that existed in Big Cypress, and we'll go over that in just a minute. And they had some questions on the infrastructure that's currently there today, but also what the project would be proposing that maybe they might have to deal with in the future from an O&M perspective. So the first policy item I want to kind of reorient and go over again is in Big Cypress National Preserve. And because we are looking at taking this triangle area out and then down here with the L28 South, backfilling some of those, backfilling some of that canal, there's a lot of private lands that exist within Big Cypress. And it's a little hard to see on this map at a distance, but there's like some areas of red that we see. One is north of I-75, a little bit north up along the L28 interceptor. This is an area that they call the sanctuary where people live. It's private property. It's very close to one of the features we're looking at, doing some backfilling or putting some step-down weirs in that could possibly be affected by the changes in hydrology. Another area is along the L28 South. There's some private lands there. And then down along the southern part in US 41, there's some private homes in there. All of these which are within Big Cypress. So with our federal projects, we have to comply with both federal and state law. And this is something that we call the Project Assurances and Savings Clause analysis, one of which states you cannot have an impact to the existing level services of flood protection. And so as you're moving through and modeling, you have to show that your project, even though it's having some very good benefits on changing hydrology, will not have an effect on private lands. And so we're going into the stage over the next 4 weeks where we're going to start to do some of that modeling. What makes it unique with Big Cypress is the legislation that enacted the preserve determined that these private properties were consistent and compatible with the Big Cypress National Preserve area. So if through our analysis, when we're looking at the changes in hydrology, if it is determined that there is a possible flooding impact to these private lands, we just cannot go out and say, we will then purchase your private land. They have to be willing sellers. The only person who can determine if these private lands are incompatible with the preserve is the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. So we're currently engaged with the Big Cypress staff and also with our partners, the Corps, to gain some additional elevation information in those 3 key areas that I just highlighted to do an assessment on looking at the changes in hydrology and if they will or will not have an impact to these private lands. And that information will then be worked with the Department of Interior Solicitor General's office to provide us with an opinion on whether or not they see those impacts and how we move forward and handle that. We don't wish to have any flooding impacts to anyone, but there are certain mitigation measures that we would have to look at as a result of that. Would we scale back project benefits so we don't have those impacts? Would we look at doing some flood mitigation protection, such as trying to raise their house pads, or would we potentially put berms in to try to protect them? Recognizing that we also don't want to get into the situation that we have in the 8.5 square mile area, where that's an ongoing, consistent issue for us. So that's one of our larger policy items that we are working through. This is the approach that we're taking right now to do an additional assessment. And then as we move forward and do that, again, we would like some of your feedback on the approach that we've taken to this, and that we also will bring back additional information for your consideration on this item. Next, as Mindy was talking about on this map, in this area that's highlighted, by backfilling in the triangle area and down along the L28 South, these features from water flowing through Big Cypress tended to have more water flowing into Water Conservation Area 3A. So as SERP envisioned decompartmentalizing the western side, when we add the Western Everglades in, we saw that the benefits that the Central Everglades Planning Project had as it brought water south we saw some of the flows that typically went over into the eastern side of Everglades National Park were now being kept on the western side and now coming into the western side of Everglades National Park. So the benefits that the Central Everglades Planning Project had that said we saw these flows going to Shark River Slough, some of those have been not so much redirected, but kept more over on the western side as the project has intended them to, and bring them into the western side of Everglades National Park. It was a concern to us because we saw that there was some shift in benefits. We weren't losing benefits, but we were shifting them. And that the modeling that we did when we looked at western Everglades along with central Everglades was SEP as it is today, as it was authorized, but without the Packer involved. Because the Packer was just, the EAA reservoir was just approved in Word of 2018, so when we did this modeling, that was not incorporated into it. So we looked at that, looked at how the amount of water we're keeping on the western side, and we also reached out and talked to some other people on the project delivery team, the Everglades National Park staff. So the PDT team is the interagency group that works on these CERT projects, and asked them for their official input and advice and opinion on whether or not they saw an issue with shifting those flows from the east to the west. And they have indicated to us that this shift in water from the east to the west is consistent with SERP goals and the SERP vision of decompartmentalization. And so at this point, they did not see an issue with that. However, as we move forward and do the final modeling runs, we will take a look at that and look at some of these alternative age features and make sure that we are consistent with those SERP goals and those SERP visions. And then the last policy item that we've been talking about that I want to go over today has to deal with water quality. And there's a few items that I want to kind of hit with this. As Mindy mentioned, water quality has been one of the big drivers for Western Everglades from a few different perspectives. And one has to do with land acquisition, and the other has to do with cost sharing. It's also been a challenge because unlike other parts of the system, we've not only had to deal with state water quality standards, but we've also had to deal with federal responsibilities, and we've also had to look at and deal with tribal responsibilities and water quality coming onto tribal reservation lands. So when we look at this map, I've got two areas highlighted. Over here on the left, we've got the west feeder, and then over here on the right is the north feeder. I just want to point out that the feeder canal basin is state responsibility. And so as water flows south from the feeder canal basin, it comes onto tribal reservation. And then it continues to flow south into a federal area. And then it goes back into the Miccosukee land, which is tribal land. And then it either goes out to Water Conservation Area 3A, or it stays here and it stays in Big Cypress National Preserve. So it's been a challenge for the project team. It's been actually mental gymnastics to go through all of this to see who has what responsibility where. And not only did we cross jurisdictions and authorities, but we also had to deal with differences between narrative standards and numeric standards. So where does that leave us? So part of the project objective was to improve water quality. So when we look towards the future and the future without, the state will meet its standards in the feeder canal basin with its existing programs and permits. But when we look downstream, the downstream criteria drive what we're going to do upstream. And in this case, it drove what we were going to do with creating stormwater treatment areas. And because the project was redirecting water, and it was also looking at putting water in different areas and meeting a different standard, it now becomes a project cost, and it becomes a project objective. So we took those three alternatives that we looked at before, recognizing that we also wanted to maximize the use of publicly owned land and district land. So for the north feeder, we redirected those flows and put an STA on the C-139 annex. So those are lands that the district owns, so we don't have to acquire any land. But back over here on the west side, there is still a need, so water traditionally currently flows down the L28 interceptor. Because those flows with the project are proposed to be redirected south and in the north end of Big Cypress, they need to meet those water quality criteria. So this is deemed essential for Everglades restoration, and as such is a project cost, and will also be cost shared. Because of that, that also drove the need to put an STA there. So right now, we are looking at some amount of private land acquisition, but not nearly the amount of private land that we were doing earlier on in the process. So next steps for the project. As Mindy mentioned, they're working on a cost estimate and a final benefits analysis for alternative H. We talked about some of the flooding impacts to private lands. The modeling that's coming up is going to look at the project assurances and savings clause, which will cover that. And then again, I'd like to highlight that we're here today to hear your input and guidance. As we move forward, we would like to come back in February to the governing board and present on this project, on the project components with your input that we see will move forward and eventually become a tentatively selective plan. The tentatively selective plan milestone date right now is scheduled for March of 2019. And just to remind everyone that this project is also looking to wrap up and finish and target a WRDA 2020 authorization, which would be the first time it would be ready for WRDA 2020. Same thing as the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Project. They're both looking for a WRDA 2020. This again is our process slide. Shows in the federal process where the governing board has input. Let's see if I can get this to come back up again. Go. So we're here for your input. This is where we're selecting the TSP in March. Here's the February 2019 governing board date, and again, in which we would like to come back to the governing board and let you know how we've incorporated your guidance and feedback and where the project is going to. So with that.
Thanks, Jennifer and Mindy. Thank you very much. Any questions from the committee? Go.
Where do I begin, Madam Chair? My head is spinning. Thank you both for that presentation. First question I think may be a silly one, but I'm not sure. Is this project in any way connected to anything we're doing with EA Reservoir? Does it affect it in any way, shape, or form?
No. Let me see if I can get back to a map, a bigger map. Oh, you know, bear with me.
So the water that's going to be coming south from that reservoir is going to be to the east?
I'm sorry.
That's fine, but you answered my question. The answer is no.
Yeah, it's not. Primarily, it deals with water within the western side, within the feeder canal basin.
I'll go on to the next question. You don't have to find the map.
Here we go. Right, there is no direct connection from water coming down and going into the EA reservoir. What I wanted to see is if, I think this is the Miami Canal? Yeah, okay, sorry. Contacts are a little old. So this is the Miami Canal. So there's no actually direct connection where most of the water we're looking at is coming out from this area over here.
Okay.
So there's no connection to that basin.
The L28 canal water quality issues that I've heard a lot about dealing with the tribes, and we've had a lot of conversations about that. Do we have any numbers on what the phosphorus and nitrogen loading is in the L28, and have we identified what the sources of that loading is coming from?
Yeah, okay. So in the SFER, we report on that every year. So we do know the numbers that are coming over the S190, and also I think we have some data for the West Weir and PC17A. So we do know those numbers. They are.
I'm going to jump in real quick because
Okay.
I just looked at these numbers yesterday. So I wanted to have some context of how much load goes to the Everglades protection area versus what we call the non-ECP basins, so not the EAA basin, not the C-139, the other basins. And we're talking about the sum of all the other basins are only 14% of the load that reached the Everglades Protection Area in water year 18. So just a frame of reference of how, in comparison, the loading is for those basins together. In this area, the concentrations, we can get you maps and send that as a follow-up for actual concentration numbers. But PC 17A, if you can point to that, we're at number 2. So that up there is closer to 200 parts per million total phosphorus. And S140, if I remember correctly, was down in the 70s. But we can pull that and make
Did you
sure.
say 200 and 170, Ava? Is that what you said?
Up at the little circle number 2,
Yep.
you're up at around 200, but
Okay.
down at number 4, or I'm sorry, just north of number 4, those are less than 100 parts per billion total phosphorus.
Okay, so the loading that we have in this basin is significantly better than we have on the north end of Lake Okeechobee?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, okay,
Yes.
all right, perfect. You talked about a lot, you said significant private land in Henry County would be required, and I think I heard a number of like 27,000. How many, do you have a rough estimate of how many acres that is in Henry County?
Right, so when we were here in August, you'll probably recall that some of those features, we're looking at close to 20,000 acres, right? So one of the things we really wanted to do was look at, what can we do to put together a cost-effective and implementable plan that minimizes land acquisition? So I think now we're down to 3,000?
Yeah, the effective area of that western STA is 3,300 acres or so. There'll need more acreage to, build the amenities that go with it and also to connect it to Big Cypress via a flowway.
And that 3,300 acres, it would be private land acquisition? We don't own any of that?
No.
Okay. And when you mentioned private homes down there, are you referring to the hunting camps that I've flown over down there, or are you talking about primary residences?
So, so in Big Cypress, they kind of break it up into 2 categories. They call them front country and back country. The back country are the hunt camps that you're referring to, which are currently right in the marsh areas right now. The front country, they do have road access. There are some homes, like actual homes out there with septic tanks. North of I-75, where Mindy's pointing right now, is an area called the Sanctuary. It's an actual community, with homes that are dry right now. We're looking at possibly increasing the water levels by up to 1 foot. So we need to see, what does that look like? Can some of the project features be altered in such a way that we still get the benefits, but we're not having some of that, increases in hydrology in those areas? And then down along US 41, there are homes down there. Some have been raised already, others have not. So, and it's not all throughout areas of Big Cypress. I apologize. The eastern side is a little bit more at risk than the west. The west has some higher land areas, and the changes in hydrology are not as, we don't see them as much as we do on the eastern side.
Okay, and then just to make sure I understand, when you were talking about basically, I guess, rerouting and sending that water east to the C-139 annex, I believe, and instead of sending that water down the L-28 to the triangle, that would be basically filled in, you're sending that water east now, so that would prevent the Tree Island inundation, the things that we hear about from the tribes. Am I correct on that? Am I understanding that correctly?
So I think you're talking about this area in here, right, and sending the water into the annex. One of the major benefits of that is the water will then come out and go down the L-28 where a lot of the STA 5-6 flows currently go. They'll be able to flow into Northwestern Water Conservation Area 3A, which is very overdrained. So it'll help raise the groundwater there and help attenuate some of the fires that we see. And it also helps with some of the shift in flows and benefits that we saw from water in eastern Everglades National Park into western Everglades National Park.
Jamie? So I have a couple questions. I'm really glad that in one of your slides, you talked about the savings clause. And I know this isn't like directly related to this, but we don't talk about the savings clause enough. So could you just give me like a brief little, talk about the savings clause real quick and how that relates to this project?
Sure.
And I'll have follow-up questions.
So, project assurances and savings clause covers two primary things. One is you cannot have impacts to the existing level services of flood protection.
Who sets that? Who sets that rule? What agency, what level of government sets that rule for the savings clause? Is that a federal?
It's federal.
Okay. And who can change that?
Do you know who? Congress?
Congress? By way of what? A bill, a WRDA? How does that happen?
Yeah.
So if I may, I'll jump in here for a second.
John knows where I'm going here.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jennifer.
So
No worries.
when you talk about set it, how's it changed, it's the level of service, level of flood protection that any given area in the system had as of December 12th of 2000, when CERP was signed and authorized. So you go back to whatever it was then, and you have to at least maintain that level of service
Forever, or until SERP is complete?
through the implementation of whatever project you may be under considering.
Okay. I'm asking this question for those of you who don't know about the irresponsible narrative that's going around talking about changing water allocations to existing users around Lake Okeechobee because of discharges. So I wanted to be sure that we were telling the truth to the public and that we were talking in reality here about how these things are done and that you can't just decide a winner or loser when it comes to who could get water and who shouldn't get water. So I find it highly irresponsible that a member of Congress would be pursuing that narrative. And so I just thought I would take that moment, since you mentioned the savings clause. Spurring on that, though, when SERP is complete, not that I think that's going to be in our lifetime, maybe, I hope so, how does, when these projects are all delivering, let's just assume North is delivering, West is delivering, South is delivering, are there then is there a water allocation plan, maybe Eva will answer this, for the projects? So you have the existing water users that you just talked about, John, but then is there then an allocation for the project to keep the project successful?
Yeah, I can take this one. So, and I can see Matt over there wanting to answer the question, because this one's important to him. And yeah, he's over there wanting to get up. So you come on up if you want to make sure I get it right. But yes, so the investment that we make together, and I'm pointing to Colonel Reynolds because she's sitting in the audience. So the investment that we make together, part of making sure that that investment stays over time is by protecting the water made available to the environment. And so we do that with a few tools. Some of them are regulatory, but that's essentially how we do it.
Great. Thank you for the illustration and indulging me. I appreciate it. Anybody else have any?
That's why we're
other-
here.
Oh. Go ahead.
Thank you. You mentioned you had some feedback from the BCB, and they talked about how the increased water levels would be beneficial, but they were concerned about some of the ongoing O&M that they may be responsible for. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Right. Their question was really, is any additional infrastructure that's being proposed by this project, would they then be responsible for O&M? Right, so if we put in an additional weir or water control structure, would they have to then take that on as part of their O&M responsibilities?
And to clarify, this is technically outside of the BCB scope of work, but because it's Collier County, they just wanted to make sure they understood whether that would end up the BCB board or with this board. Yeah.
They're both. I can understand that, their concerns, yeah.
So with the reduction in private land acquisition, you still have a very broad range in cost. I think it was 1.3 to 4.1 was on the slide. Is that, and I remember the very high number from the August presentation that you gave us. Are we still looking at a $4 billion project roughly in today's dollars? I'll remind everybody because it won't be built today. It'll be built sometime in the very distant future, and it'll be much higher than that. But is that $4 billion number still, or what is that number with this revised plan in today's dollars?
Well, it's certainly not that $4 billion number. That number range was the first round of cost estimates for those first three alternatives. We don't have a cost estimate for the current alternative, but we expect it to be on the low end of that range or perhaps below that range. That was,
So you think it's going to be more in line with like 1.4, kind of the other projects we're looking at?
yes.
Somewhere in that ballpark?
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. And so we have 200 metric tons, is that right, Ava, if I'm saying it right, from the loading? That's in metric tons, the 200 number?
No, sir, I actually pulled it up. And
Parts
that's
per billion?
concentration from PC 17A. Of course, it varies, but that's just a good number to talk from PC 17A, concentration of total phosphorus.
Okay, so it's 200 and then it was 70 as you move down, you described?
Yes, so I actually pulled it up because I wanted to make sure. So the summary of the water year, 2018 total phosphorus from those tributaries to the Everglades Protection Area. The feeder canal basin had a flow-weighted mean concentration of 123. The L28 had 69. So as a comparison, that varies over the year about what's happened, but that's a good frame of reference to talk from.
And the goal is before that water gets to the park to be 10, is that correct?
Yes.
That's
Yes,
what
that's
that's what we're trying to achieve. Okay.
Anybody else? Any public comment? Pete?
Jennifer, thank you. Back in 2016, when we started this, there were hopes that perhaps this would be a win-win for the Caloosahatchee as well, that we have an opportunity to divert some water that is excess to the needs of the Caloosahatchee Basin and direct it into the Big Cypress, which we still understand is in deficit in many areas, the ability to raise the water tables so that we would reduce the incidence of fire. A lot of moving parts. None of what I say should be construed to say that I'm not fully supportive of meeting the water quality concerns of the tribes. They are legitimate and they are accurate. If we're putting water more than 10 parts per billion into the system, we are degrading the system. So how we do that at a reasonable cost is the real challenge. We had hoped in the earlier discussions that there might be a role for ASR. Obviously, it was filtered out here, one, because of the unknowns. We're just implementing some major ASR north of the lake, hopefully soon, and we'll learn from that. And maybe there's a role in phase 2 as we get into a development. This is a very expensive project, and it certainly is one that has been postponed for a long time. The tribes have been expecting some action on their legitimate demands, and I think this meets that operation, and it will have the support of the folks in the Western Everglades that I represent. That being said, the challenges are significant. Getting to the 10 when we don't get to 10 anywhere is a real challenge. Whether or not we can even move forward until we have some assurance that restoration strategies is the technology we need in order to get to that goal becomes a challenge. So I appreciate all the hard work. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. And I hope we think in broader terms that this is, as in many of our other projects, phase 1 of a bigger plan that ultimately, over a longer period of time, we might be able to implement with other increments. There's another factor that was on the table back in 2016. We anticipated then that we would have a dispersed water management program on illegal land that would deal with roughly 100,000 acre feet a year. The potential for that going into groundwater was huge. We heard from the task force and the working group last week, the lack of knowledge we have about groundwater movement in this area. There's certainly some studies that indicate as much as a third of the water that used to go into the Everglades came out of groundwater and Mullet Slough, and if we just raise those levels again, we might be able to have a whole lot of natural filtration, providing better quality water. Just as there was subsidence south of the lake, there was massive subsidence in the upper part of the Caloosahatchee. The Caloosahatchee used to have 25 feet of sand bank alongside. That took a lot of water, and it went in a lot of places that were beneficial to the park. So you have our support, but it is a disappointment that we're not meeting some of the goals that we hoped we would have been able to achieve back in 2016.
Thanks, Pete. Anybody have any other comments? Any more public comment? Any general public comment? I will just add that I was thrilled to see a bill passed, or a bill filed, I guess this week, to initiate septic tank inspections required every 5 years by Representative Robinson, I believe his name is. So I'm hopeful that that's going to be successful, but ultimately I'm just happy to see the conversation continuing and people really working toward septic tank conversions and not being unwilling to talk about those things. So I was very pleased to see that moving forward, and I hope it gets a lot of support. And with that, I will call the question ask for a motion and second to adjourn. Thank you. Thanks for coming.